and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Pollinators come in a variety of sizes, shapes, and colors. Most of us think of bees as the superstars of pollination, but butterflies, beetles, even bats are important pollinators. Unfortunately, the habitats and the numbers of many pollinators are shrinking. Now, new research at the University of Vermont reveals that there are specific perennial flowers that we can plant in our home landscapes that will benefit a wide range of important pollinators. To find out more, I'm joined by one of our frequent contributors, UVM horticulturalist Leonard Perry. And welcome to you, Leonard, and you brought someone with you today.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, Annie White worked with me for several years and recently got her PhD in the Department of Plant and Soil Science at UVM, and in addition to teaching some courses there, including ones on pollinators, and that was a topic of her work there, and specifically looking at, which we'll be talking about today, the difference between species and cultivars of those species, cultivar being a cultivated variety, to see if there's a difference as far as pollinator preference.
And so remind our viewers why pollinators are so important.
Well, that's a good question, Judy. I get that question a lot from people. You know, they have yards, they're rural, a lot of Vermont's rural, and we have a lot of pollinators around. They say, what's the big deal? Well, some people may have seen, you know, in the research, probably one of the first things was the colony collapse disorder, you know,
right.
But it's basically a complex of many factors with beehives and going down a lot of issues with those. And then there was the issue a few years ago of a misuse of a pesticide out in Oregon containing neonicotinoids. It's called neonics, and that's the big thing a lot of people know now, because a lot of stores have quit selling pesticides containing those because they are very damaging if misused to pollinators, and a lot of pesticides sometimes are misused. And that's, I guess, one of the words of caution is, even if it's organic, read the label, use pesticides properly. Even organic pesticides can really harm pollinators. In South Carolina recently, there was a big issue. They were spraying for mosquitoes. And again, probably a misuse and a lot of bees killed. But, you know, bees are only one, as you alluded to, there are many types of pollinators. We have the European honeybee, and again, the colony collapse disorder. But native bees, there are over 270 different species just in Vermont. Of those, a lot of times they're more efficient at pollinating crops, perhaps blueberries, things like that. So there's lots of different pollinators. We brought a couple pictures that Annie took some great pictures in her research. Of course, bumblebees is probably the one that most people are familiar with, but then there are many others. Another one that people often see is the green bee here on an aster, and we'll take a look at asters in a minute. Annie will tell us about those. And then, of course, the monarch butterflies. We just don't see many. In fact, I learned that they're being considered, being put on the endangered species list because the numbers have declined at least 90%. A lot of that, and a lot of the pollinators, the native ones, it's due to habitat loss. So we have native bees declining due to habitat loss and other pollinators, honeybees declining due to this colony collapse issues. Yet 75% of our edible crops require some form of pollinator to visit so we can eat that food. And example, apples in Vermont, we have about 3,000 acres, and those require pollinators. So a lot at stake here to help those, even if you have a few. Overall, the big picture declining, all we can do to help them, hence Annie's research and what we can do in our own landscape.
Well, Annie, congratulations on your PhD. You were actually on this program 3 years ago when you first started your research. Tell us how you became interested in studying pollinators.
Right, well, prior to starting my PhD, I did my master's work in landscape architecture and worked in the professional design industry for about 6 years. And during that time, I was really interested in what we call ecological landscaping, so routinely using native plants for all of the benefits that they provide to pollinators and to butterflies, and kind of that lower food chain. And I used a lot of these native plants, and I would often specify the use of a native plant in a landscape, and my list would get turned over to a landscape contractor, and they, for whatever reason, if they couldn't find we sometimes call it a straight species, they would substitute it for a cultivar, which is still the same genus and species, but often has these branded single quotation fun names. And they felt like it was an equivalent substitute. And so that got me thinking, well, is it really ecologically equivalent? Are there some trade-offs to using all of these cultivars? Are they providing the same benefit to pollinators, to butterflies, to birds? And I couldn't find any research on the topic, and so that's what instigated my further interest in and coming back to Vermont, which is where I grew up, and working with Dr. Perry was a really good fit because of all of his previous work studying perennial plants.
So tell us a little bit of what qualifies as a native plant and the difference between some species and cultivars.
So a native plant is a species that has historically grown in a specific region, was present pre-settlement. And so in my research, I qualify a native plant as something that has grown in an ecosystem in the northeastern U.S. Sometimes people have more specific definitions. So then a cultivar, a native cultivar, sometimes we call them just nativars, that's a cultivated variety of the native plant. So it originated as a native plant, and then the humans have manipulated that plant in some way, selected it, sometimes crossbred, sometimes hybridized it for certain characteristics that we find valuable in the industry, whether it's an interesting color change or a shorter stature of the plant, sometimes a double flower versus a single flower, a disease resistance. So there are some qualities that gardeners find very attractive. So we alter these native species into these native cultivars.
But do the bees find them attractive? That's
Exactly,
the question.
that's the question.
So you brought along some photographs of some plant pairings that you studied. Tell us how they work with the pollinators.
Sure. So I studied about 12 different species and paired those with a popular cultivar that would have been seen in the industry. So the next 6 plants that I'm going to show here on the screen are examples where pollinators preferred the native species. And the native species is shown on the left here. So that's your white yarrow, very common kind of weedy wildflower. We see it throughout the U.S. And the pollinators really preferred that over this really fancy, attractive strawberry seduction cultivar. And that color change may have been really significant. And here's another example where the pollinators prefer the species on the left. This example of a hyssop, it was more of a color change in the leaf color. So gardeners might find that leaf color really attractive in their gardens, but the pollinators didn't seem to find the plant as attractive.
Interesting.
Another example where this color change in the cultivar may have made that flower less attractive to the pollinators.
Okay, we got another one too we're going to show.
And here's Helen's flower, sometimes called sneezeweed. This is a really great late blooming flower. It's blooming September, October, along with your asters, and the pollinators by far preferred the yellow, the species. And then this kind of orangey, reddish cultivar actually bloomed in the middle of the summer, so completely different bloom periods. And so the pollinators really like the yellow one. And this is a spiderwort. Again, the pollinators like that species, the kind of this really bright, attractive lavender color versus this rosy pink that bloomed throughout the summer but had far fewer flowers and probably had less pollen for the pollinators to collect. And here's an example of New England aster. This is a really important late flowering plant for a lot of bees as well as monarch butterflies. Use the nectar from this flower for energy. And this is an example where, again, the pollinators by far just flocked to the species and very few pollinators were seen on the cultivar.
Interesting. Now I think you have a video that sort of shows that.
Yeah, so here's a side-by-side comparison. The native species is on the left and has more of a purple color, and the cultivar is on the right in that kind of pink magenta color.
Boy, there
and you
aren't
can,
any
right,
none.
I mean, you can see here and there a few bumblebees coming in, a few honeybees checking out the cultivar, but they're just flocking to everything. You'll see even some moths and butterflies in your screen here. So really significant difference between these two. And I think this was one of the clearest examples where even though some of these cultivars have kind of a nicer form and maybe an interesting color, that it does seem that those are native species that have persisted in our landscapes for hundreds of years are providing pollinators with the most benefit.
Now, did you see plants that you put in that there was no difference whatsoever?
Yeah, I did find several of them where there weren't a difference, about 4 of them.
Let's take a look at those.
So here's an example. Here's a milkweed. This is sometimes called butterfly milkweed. This is just a simple color change, and this color variation you actually can find in nature as well. Yellow is a very attractive color for pollinators. So pollinators really visited these at equal rates and didn't seem to show a preference.
Okay.
And this is a bee balm. The cultivar on the right was selected primarily for mildew resistance, which is a big problem with bee balms. So that was seen as an advantage, and the pollinators didn't really seem to...
Good news is it makes everybody happy.
Right. Mm-hmm. And this is beard tongue. The selection on the right was mostly because of the deeper red stem and leaf color, which is attractive, but the flowers were very, very similar, and the pollinator showed no preference between the two. And here are some of our black-eyed Susans, the cultivar Gold Sturm. That's a really long-standing, very, very popular cultivar. And good news is it seems to be just as attractive to our really tiny pollinators, or what like to visit this flower.
And you actually found one pairing that the bees and pollinators enjoyed the cultivar.
Yeah. So surprisingly, this one cultivar, this is Culver's root, fantastic plant. All pollinators just love this one, widely underused in the garden. But the cultivar Lavender Towers, or lavendel term, has a little bit more of a violet-colored flower, and surprisingly, significantly more pollinators on this flower. So I think for some reason that plant was also providing probably more nectar and more pollen.
Excellent.
I would echo that in my own garden. I found that Lavender Towers about 4 to 5 feet high, middle of summer for several weeks, covered with all manner of bees and pollinators. I've just never seen such. So that's a great plant, as Annie said, underutilized, I think.
So I'm wondering, if you looked at one cultivar of a native species, would you expect that others to be similar in their pollinator attraction, like the coneflowers that Leonard mentioned?
Right, yeah. So I think that my research shows that there can be differences and that we need to study a lot more cultivars. I only looked at one cultivar of each species. But I did, in another study, looked at multiple cultivars of Echinacea. So that's our coneflower, which is native. And I think we have a few shots here. So I compared the native species, Echinacea purpurea, with 3 different cultivars. And I found that there were differences with all of these cultivars, that the majority of pollinators still preferred the native species. And then there was also a one cultivar selection that was just a color change. It was a white
Go on to the next
selection.
slide there.
And then we got into, so you can see in these images, the top one is the native species, and then a white selection. And then the bottom 2 is where the pollinators really avoided these flowers. One is a double flower. That's an example where double flowers are making the nectar and pollen inaccessible to pollinators. They can't get there, and oftentimes there's less nectar and pollen for them. And then the last example was a hybrid flower, which also we have to be cautious of.
Now, you brought along a videotape, too, of your research plot, where you did your research, and maybe we could take a look at that. So where is this?
Yeah, so this is at Riverberry Farm in Fairfax, Vermont. I had one of my research plots here and a second one at Maidstone Plant Farm in Maidstone, Vermont. So they're on opposite sides of the Green Mountains. And at these 2 plots, I had these relatively large research gardens. So these are set up a little bit differently than just a typical pollinator garden. I had to have replication in the flowers that I had and replication in these blocks that I had set up. So I had these different planting units with 6 plants of the same species. And all of my observations were visual. So I spent many, many hours between 2012 and 2015 many hours in these plots watching these plants for 5 minutes at a time. And I monitored all pollinators, so I was looking at everything from honeybees and bumblebees to some of our smaller native bees, to moths and butterflies and bugs and beetles, and just monitoring their visitation rates on all of these flowers and then comparing them.
Now, where can viewers learn more about your research and recommendations on plants?
I have a research website. It's pollinatorgardens.org, And on there, I have a lot of tips about pollinator-friendly gardening, as well as just more information about this research as well.
And I know, Leonard, you have information on your website
On
as
my
well.
website, the perennials.info or .com, I've got actually 3 articles that Annie wrote about not only some of the better plants, but how to make these pollinator gardens and monarchs and issues, things to help them. A lot on there.
And this is a great time of year to kind of poke around and see what you maybe want to add to your garden for next year for pollinators.
Exactly, make those plans now.
Thanks for joining us. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.